Welcome back to our Application Lifecycle Development course. In this lesson, we're going to set up our cloud resources. We've decided to use Azure as our host for this course since it's so easy to set up and configure, and yet it mimics a lot of real-world options that are available to us. Plus, it's almost free to set up. So let's talk through what our environment is going to look like. And here's a slide I've created that kind of describes for you the various parts we're going to set up. And yes, there's a lot of stuff here. And this is a real world design. It's actually a simple real world design for anything over about 2 or 3 people or anything where it's a production type environment. And so let's talk through the various stacks here. First, we have development. And development, we have that MVC website. And then it has to have the authentication database and a separate user database. And I did separate those out. I could have combined them, but I really like the idea of not combining the two of them, keeping them separate for a number of reasons. So I have to have 2 different databases. And so we'll set those up. But then what happens is that's where we do all of our work and make sure that, and this is in the cloud. So we do our work locally, but if we're working with a team or somebody else, we want to see our work, kind of combined in an environment we can try out. And the really cool thing here is it mimics a real world environment, so we can see how it's going to work on the type of servers we'll be using, even if they're cheaper versions of them. So this is our development environment where we do all of our development and early testing to make sure that what we're coding is actually correct. Then we move to a staging environment. In a staging environment, there's different schools of thought here depending on the size of your team and the flow that you go through. But a staging environment is where you get ready to make sure this is the right stuff to actually deploy. This is not where you're doing active development. You try and do active development in the development set, but then when you move to staging, this is where you have QA testers run against it, or you test to make sure that it's going to work against, more clean data or data that's closer to production data. And basically, you just make sure that this is ready to go live before you're live. You might even give this to a subset of users just to try out, not as a real world thing, but as a, hey, if we brought this to real world, is it okay? Once you're set on staging and say, yes, this is what we want to go forward, we're going to move to the next step, which is production. And notice how each of these is a mirror image of the one before. And that's pretty important too, because by the time you get to production, even in this simple environment, we'll have done the deployment 3 times. We deploy to development, then we deploy to staging, and finally, we deploy to production. And since we've done this 3 times with the same code, we've gotten all those bugs worked out before we hit production. Because the last thing you want to have happen is you deploy to production and realize, oh, we're missing files. Oh, we're missing this. Oh, we're missing that. And production is down. We don't want that. And that's why we really want to have this process where we've done it multiple times the same way so we get the same results. If you deploy to development and find you're missing files, that's okay. Yes, you might crash development for a little while, but that's what development's there for. And so you fix whatever you need to permanently in development, redeploy to development, make sure it works, then deploy that to staging, make sure it works cleanly. If it doesn't, start over at the beginning and do development and staging again until you're ready. And then finally, when you've got a clean build that works great and that the code is the way you want it, then and only then do you move it to production. So that's kind of the flow that we're going to go through. And these are the 9 things we have to create today in Azure. 3 websites, 6 databases. So let's set these up. So let's go to our portal. So portal.azure.com. If you don't have one of these, then you can set one up for free, and they give you some free resources, Microsoft does, to get you started. And it will allow you to then continue on in some free things for life, which is great. But it isn't that expensive, especially not, like you just saw, With my enterprise license of Visual Studio, I also get, I believe, $150 worth of credits every month to use towards whatever I want. In this case, these demos here. So we're going to spend about $5 a database today, times 6. So $30 a month on databases. Now, if you don't want to go that far, that's fine. You can use that with your free credits to try it out. But if you don't want to go that far in the real world, that's fine. You can do it on premises or in other places and still have the same type of process. But this really easily illustrates for us in a way that we can put on screen quickly all the different pieces. So let's start off by creating some resources. Let's start off creating the development environment. So we need the web app first. And we're going to call this web app LP Development. Let's see if it's available. It is, green check mark. And my subscription. And I'm going to create a resource group. Let's call it the Lifecycle Project. That's what LP stands for, is Lifecycle Project. I'm going to create one resource group. And essentially, it's collection of, like it says there, it's a collection of different resources that share the same life cycle and their permissions and policies. I'm going to use one resource group for everything. Now, you could use one resource group per set, so development, staging, and production. That'd be probably a little better for a production environment, but in this case, it's not really a big deal, and it keeps things simple. The reality is it'd probably be fine for a production environment as well, but it's up to you how granular you want to get. Okay, so we're going to do a Windows operating system, and we're going to do code publish. And the app service plan, I have a cheap hosting app service plan, but I'm going to create a new one. So let's call this the Lifecycle Project App Service Plan. Yep, it's long, but the reality is if you don't name things really well, you're not quite sure what they do. And Azure tends to have hundreds and hundreds of objects by the time you're done with an environment. So I would encourage you, go ahead and name it really well. So we're going to go in East 2. And for my pricing plan, I'm going cheap. So you could go free, which is 60 minutes per day of compute. And that does not mean it runs for 60 minutes a day. It means that as it's processing it, it counts those minutes. But we're going to go a little higher than that. Let's go for the B1 plan, which allows you a few things that are kind of nice. For example, custom domains and SSL. And I can have up to 3 instances for each one. So this is great for dev and testing. For production, there's some nice additions. For example, staging slots. That's what I really like. So a staging slot allows you to swap websites. You test it out on a different URL. When you're ready, you just swap. And all it does is redirect where the URL points to. And so you can always test live before it's live, but it's a live environment. So that's really nice. Traffic Manager is nice. And Autoscale is nice as well. So, but we're going to go for the dev test, which is, and it tells you right here, it's $32.74 a month. That estimated just means that it's depending on the number of days and all the rest, of course. So it's based upon time we use it. So we'll hit apply, and we'll use this for all of our 3 websites we create: the dev website, the staging website, and the production website. The key here is if you do create paid resources in Azure, just turn them off when you're not using them, like delete them. Because if you delete them, then you don't get charged anymore, and so you only get charged for that little bit that you used it. So even if it's $34 a month, if you use it for 2 days, that's only $2. Okay, so we got our lifecycle project is our resource group. We're creating a new app service plan. We're not going to do application insights. We hit create. It's going to validate all of that. And once it's done validating, then it'll pop up over here and start creating. There we go. So now we're in the deployment process for that website. And you'll see that right here. But while we're waiting, let's go ahead and create another resource. And we're going to keep on in the development vein. So SQL database. We're going to need a couple of these. So let's call this the LP dev auth DB. So this is the lifecycle project development authorization database. And the resource group is going to be a lifecycle project. It's going to be a blank database. You could start off with a backup. So if you had a backup from your local machine or from somewhere else, you can grab that. Or if you wanted to, you can start off with a sample database, which is the AdventureWorks LT database. The server, we have to choose a server. In this case, create a server. So lifecycle project. Let's call it lifecycle project because it's .database.windows.net. We have to create an admin login and password, and you make sure you write those down. I'll make sure you put an EAST2 as well. Okay, so our login name will be LP admin, and the password, oops, it has to be a little longer than that. Administrator. There we go. And the password is not telling you. Just make sure it has to be longer than. Oh, nope. I was wrong. When I moused over, I thought it was yelling at me about the login name. It was yelling about the password immediately, which not a huge fan of that. But at the same time, it does give me, okay, here's the things I need to do. So that was a little nice. I wish it would have just been a little clearer that I'm not really yelling at you. I'm more telling you what you need to do. So we've got the server name. This is a SQL server. So we're creating a SQL database, which is an individual database. But we need to have a server to put it on. Now the server technically is free. But when we start putting databases on it, we pay for every database. So that's where the cost comes in. Now we're going to use the $5 databases, which are great. They're simple, they're small, and they're really cheap. So we got the server name, which will do just once for all of our databases. We have our login name and password. Our location, which we're keeping the same location as our websites. And yes, we want to allow Azure services to access the server. What that checkbox is saying is the SQL server by default has a firewall on it that prevents anybody from talking to the database. And then what you do is you start opening up holes and say, okay, well, this IP address can talk to the database, or this IP address can. And in this case, we're saying allow Azure services to talk. And so it's inside the already walled garden of Azure, they can talk between themselves. And yes, we want that. And no, we don't want a free trial of advanced threat protection. We hit OK. Now we have our server. We don't want to use Elastic Pool. That's a little more expensive, but it's a nice feature. Instead, we're going to go to Basic. And not now. And we're going to say we're going to use my favorite basic database, which based upon DTUs, which are, I believe it's database transmission units. It doesn't say off the top of the page, but essentially what it is it combines the use of memory and the use of disk and the use of network. And it creates this number. And that number determines usage. And so they say, well, this is how much usage you get. In this case, 5 DTUs, which is not very much. However, we're not putting massive loads against this. We're putting just probably ourselves hitting this. So no big deal. For a production database, absolutely not. Do not use this. But for a production database, you have lots of options where it can scale those DTUs up to 3,000 or more. Now that's a $4,500 a month database. Probably not something you're going to do tomorrow. If you are, cool. Call me. Okay, so basic DTU, 5 gigabytes, $4.99 per month, which that's really helpful to have that calculator there. And the max size is 2 gigabytes, which again shouldn't be a problem for us. And the collation, we're going to leave that as is. That's just the standard collation for database. So this is all our settings. We have our database name, our subscription, which is what we're going to be paying for it with. And then our resource group, which we're going to use the same one for everything. A blank database on the Lifecycle Project SQL Server, not an Elastic Pool, the basic database, and create. It's going to validate that. Once it validates, then it's going to start creating it, and we'll just have to wait for it to be done. In the meantime, we have completed the deployment process for our website. So we can look at that. Let's go to our app services, and we should have a website. Let's go to all resources. LP development. There we go. I don't know why. Oh, there it is. Sorry. I was just missing it. So LP development right here. That's our website. And if we want to look real quick, there's our URL. We can click on it and go to what's basically a we're waiting for something page. So it's up and running, but there's nothing here yet. And we'll get there in just a minute. Now, I've purposely left this blank, this dashboard. We can go ahead and add some of these things. For example, I'm going to pin this to the dashboard. So now I have it, so I can just click right on it and it goes directly to that, that website or that page. So we're going to create this dashboard and kind of lay it out in our flow. So now we have to create another service, SQL database. Let's call this the LP Dev User DB. Lifecycle Project, blank SQL, Lifecycle Project Server, not Elastic Pool. We want to use the basic. Don't get caught using the more expensive one. So it's basically the same thing, just with a different name. Hit create. And in the meantime, we've now completed the deployment of our new database. So we can pin that to the dashboard as well. And now while we're waiting for the next database, we can do the same process all over again for our staging environment. Resource, web app. Our web app name is LP Staging. And we're going to use the same resource group, Lifecycle Project. Let's go ahead and pin that to the dashboard while we're waiting. We're going to use Windows code. Our hosting plan is going to be the Lifecycle Project app service hosting plan, and we're going to disable application insights. We hit create. Once it validates, we can move on. Now, the databases for that, SQL database. We're going to call it LP Staging Auth DB. Resource group is correct. Server is correct. Basic DTUs is now correct. And we're good to go. Wait for that to be done. And now we can add the next resource, which is our other SQL database, the LP Staging User DB. And again, just make sure you check all the settings to make sure they haven't reverted or changed. And we're good there. So that database is done once it completes. And now we're actually deploying two at once. We're kind of, getting ahead of Azure a little bit, and that's okay, because we have more to do. Web app. This one we're going to name a little bit different, if we can. Lifecycle Project. We're going to use the Lifecycle Project resource group, and we're going to make sure that we're in the app service plan that includes Lifecycle Project. This is our production environment. Wait for that to be done. And now we'll create our SQL database. We'll pin that. Our SQL database is going to be called lifecycle. Let's pin that as well. Lifecycle project. Let's just say lifecycle auth DB. And our server is lifecycle project. We're using the basic, and everything else is correct. Once that's done, we can go on to the next step, which is going to be to create our last resource, which is a SQL database. We're going to call it lifecycle user DB. And this is going to be, again, a basic plan. And create. Now, one of the things about Azure resources is when you create them, you don't have to be stuck in that mold. You can move up. So for example, I've created my database is really small here, but I can scale them up later and say, oh, I do need more resources, and just kind of turn the knob and make them bigger and better. So same thing with websites. Now this is actually laying this out very nicely for me, which is really nice. But if it didn't, and we'll wait for this last resource to be created. Here's a little tip, by the way. Instead of dismiss all, which I wish that was not the default, there's this little ellipsis here. You can click it and say dismiss completed. And it cleans out everything that's been completed, but not the ones that are still running. Now I can dismiss all. Okay, so now I have a really clean dashboard that I have the three stacks. So my development stack, my staging stack, and my production stack. And these are pretty much mirrors of each other. But if it didn't lay out that way, or if I want to change something, you can hit edit here and kind of move these around in a grid. It even shows you, okay, well, different screen sizes will show different amounts of space. So plan accordingly. But in this case, I like it. That works for me. So there we go. So there's our dashboard with our three stacks for our three different environments. Now, while we're here, let's talk a little bit about Azure. Because right now I've just scratched the real basics of the surface of Azure. We've created an app service, which is essentially a website, but we've also created a SQL database. So those are the two really basic things that Azure offers, but there's a lot more than that. In fact, if you look at all services, there's a ton of stuff in here. And the thing is, they just keep adding. So I've gone here and gone, oh, there's a new service, and found something I really like. But one of the things that can happen really quickly is you get overwhelmed. For example, maybe I don't use 3/4 of these things, and I don't typically. I haven't even started using Azure Cosmos DB yet. So in virtual machines, I rarely use them anymore because I don't have to, which I love the fact that I don't have to. So if you wanted to change this list, for example, first of all, you can, when you're mousing over, notice the ellipsis. That's a drag and drop. So I could come down here and look at my SQL databases and say, well, I want those up right next to app services. And it's kind of drop in place. And resource group, I don't even want that on here, in which case you can come and find it in here and uncheck the box or uncheck the star. Notice it's gone away now. And all resources, that's helpful. Cost management building, don't use it that often. Help and support, don't use it that often. And so you kind of go through here and start checking and unchecking things that you do or do not use. Now notice there is duplicates, app services here, and there's also app services that I saw up somewhere else too. And that's okay, because it really is just there it is. It's a grouping thing. So there's grouping it in different areas. So this is under web and this one's under compute. They're both similar enough that they both should probably have it in there. So you can just come through and just start there, but these are my favorites that I use all the time. Now, I will cover more in a future course on Azure, but for now, I think this is good enough. It gets us started and allows us to start working with just the tools we need. Okay, so if you want to learn more, that's coming, but for right now, I think this is good enough. Okay, so that's it for setting up our cloud setup. Next, we'll get into the actual continuous integration process.